Satnam, thank you so much for sharing that. A chapter of two halves, one our relationship to the state and the other one our relationship to each other. And Paul has put them together, two very distinctive types of relationship. Now I'm going to share a story that I've never shared before, ever, publicly, and it pertains to World War II. And as a young boy, I noticed a scar on my grandfather's neck. It was an obvious scar. It wasn't a little one where you kind of notice it one day, but it went from ear to throat to Adam's apple. It was dramatic and it was messy, but it had been healed a long time by this point. So I said as a young boy, "Grandad, where's this scar from?" And he said, "It's from the war, Richard. I'll tell you about it when you're a little bit older." When that day came, when I was a little bit older, he sat me down and told me the most amazing story. My granddad, he said, well, he didn't say my granddad. My granddad said he was a prisoner of war under the Japanese, and he tried to escape and got caught. He faced all sorts of dangers and threats, including tough interrogation. What boy does not want a granddad like that? And in all of this, he was threatened and then cut with a machete from ear to Adam's apple. And it looked like he had been attacked. And that was the story. In January next year, he would be 101 years old, but unfortunately he died in his mid-60s in 1985. Years later, I was reflecting on this and I asked my own dad about his father's scar. My dad sat me down, not on his lap because I was a grown man myself by this point, and he said, "I wouldn't like what I'm about to hear." So I assured him that Grandad had told me the full story, the capture, the escapes, the interrogation, the machete, all of these horrible things. My dad said to me very quietly, "Son, it's worse than that." So I listened with a kind of grotesque fascination. Wouldn't you? Yeah, you would, I can tell. He said, "One day your granddad went to the dentist to have a sore tooth taken out. The dentist took the tooth out all right, but being very drunk, the dentist made a few mistakes along the way. My granddad was never a prisoner of war under the Japanese. That was a granddad story to a grandson. And he never even met a Japanese person. He didn't even like Japanese food. I don't know what's wrong with him. He drove trucks in the war and never left Northern Europe throughout the length of the war, but at least during that time he never had any more toothache. My love for my grandfather never diminished as a result of that." That's my wartime story. Not really a wartime story, is it? But I will come back to that in a moment. We are continuing in Romans 13. We've come from, we're in the final section of Romans now, which is chapters 12 to 16, which is the section that I've called service, the fifth of 5 S's. Sin, salvation, sanctification, sovereignty, and now service is one of the ways that you can shape and structure the whole book of Romans. Chapter 12 deals with sacrifice and worship, and then what that looks like in our relationships to, with, for each other and in the world. Chapter 13 has also 2 different directions as well. The relationship you would have noticed of citizens to the governing authorities, citizens to the state, and therefore what this means as the working out of this as neighbours in a community. All of us qualify. We are all under governing authorities, and we all have relationships in the state, so to speak. The following 2 chapters, which we'll come to in the next couple of weeks, concern the social and relational dynamics between the weak in the faith and the strong in the faith. And this is very, very deliberate in the way that Paul is articulating this, given the problems that the Roman church were facing with their divisions of Jewish and Gentile believers. Now, it should be clear what the Christian faith is. Christian faith is right worship of God leads to right relationships. Nobody can have sound doctrine and be bad relationally. Good doctrine leads to right relationships. So in chapter 13, 1 to 7, this is about the governing authorities, the civic authorities, and there are 4 categories, and that's on the screen now. These verses talk about the divine origin of the civic authority. They talk about the protecting role of the civic authority. Paul talks about that the civic authority is an authority that has been given by God and outlines its citizens' duties to that authority. It's quite a lot packed into 7 verses. I don't know how he does it time and time again. But remember the context Paul is writing into. At the height of the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana across the known world then, reaching as far as Britain. In circumstances where the authorities themselves, and often did in Paul's case, turn against you with a viciousness that you thought would come from the pit of hell. And Paul bore testimony to that with his beatings, imprisonments, and shipwrecks, and all of those things. But Paul writes in verse 1, right off the top, there is no authority except that which God has established. It's quite something to read that, isn't it? It's important to be clear about this, though. This passage has often been used and misused wrongly, badly. This is not a green light for any kind of regime justifying its evil deeds because it says we've been instituted by God. Most despotic regimes around the world do inhabit a divine quality about them, don't they? Think of North Korea. They view their leader as a god. I think the Christians in North Korea, as hidden and frightened as they may well be, would have something to say about that. And so they wouldn't go to Romans 13 to justify that authority. So it's not a green light for every single authority, but Paul is talking in a particular context. He's not addressing the issue of tyrannical regimes. What have we just done? Celebrating 2 minutes silence, remembering, calling to mind the great sacrifice of our war dead and the sacrifice of the war living, the cost that goes with that. Easy to forget. Standing up to tyranny. Saying no to evil and tyrannical rule, such as we saw with Nazi Germany. So Paul is not addressing that at this time. In the same way, we think of Paul addressing families, doesn't he? Husbands and wives and children and slaves and masters within that household group. He says there's a righteous order to these things, even though within those things there is profound dysfunction, and we live and work to address those dysfunctions. And the same is true for the church. We can have an ideal view of the church. Anybody? Have you still got an idealized view of the church? Has it been knocked out of you yet? But within that, God calls us together as brothers and sisters to be family, filled with the Spirit of God, going about the things of God, learning to love what God loves, becoming more Christ-like. It goes on, as Satnam read at the end, putting on Christ is to just live in Christ, to abide with him, to be grafted in, to draw on the strength and the life of Christ as we're grafted in. So even though there are profound dysfunctions in civic authorities and our own families, heaven help us all. But here we are, praying for each other in an imperfect, broken world, saying yes to God And so Paul is addressing that ideal state, the proper function as the state should be. So, without getting into discussions about particular shortcomings, gosh, we could be here all day and miss the lunch after church. By the way, there's lunch after church. You're all invited. The Bible speaks about these issues all over the place in different contexts, all of the dysfunctions. So, for example, in Romans 13, we have God has initiated and instituted the civic authority, but then we see when the civic authority, when the state or the ruling class are utterly demonic, we approach Revelation 13, and we see the beast rising from the sea, which is precisely how we should imagine the rise of the Nazi regime or any other tyrannical regime, as a beast rising from the sea with demonic inspiration. And so we hold these things in tension with each other and must never use Romans 13 as we must always obey the governing authorities. We must always obey. That's just blindness. Paul is not speaking to those kind of things. Even in the Bible itself, there are pushbacks against governing authorities. The book of Acts, chapter 16 and 24, deals specifically with the abuses that Paul faced on his travels. Many times he offered such respect to the people that were questioning or challenging him, but he knew in the Lord that he trusted, in whose mission he was on, to never ever give in. What did the apostles do in Acts 4? It is better to obey God rather than man. So we have to navigate that dividing line when the civic authorities instituted by God cross over the line from Romans 13 to Revelation 13, when they become the authority given to the beast that is rising from the sea. It is always better, always, always, always. This is where we need courage, moral courage, in a day when we still remember the war dead of the 2 world wars, and yet catastrophes are happening almost daily, being pumped through the newspapers and into our homes on the TV. Isn't it heartbreaking, church, to see this still going on? What is wrong with us? We need Christ. It is better to obey God rather than man. And so Romans 13 is for good governance and for an ordered society. When there is good governance, when society is ordered, peaceable people live under that peaceably. So in your life at some point, there must have been times when you would have disobeyed, right? Anybody? Yeah, there's at least one. There's a few nods, a few quiet. You must have, come on. I'm not the only one, surely. Or has it been quiet acquiescence to the status quo of things? Would you have been at Martin Luther's side? Yes. 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 Would you have been at John Calvin's side, fighting the Reformation and the breaking free of the tyranny of what was then a practical outworking of Roman Catholicism? Yeah, I hope so. Maybe not to the degree of the violence that was included. No. It's messy, isn't it? It's just complicated. Don't ask about our church family. It's complicated, right? But yeah, I want to be in the fight. I want to be at Martin Luther's side. And all the other reformers saying no to the governing authorities when they overstep the mark. Why? Because it's better by far to obey God rather than man. Is there anybody here who, take that off, not yet, I'll let you know when that one comes up. When, during the Vietnam War, were there protests in this country against that war? Anybody? There were. Did anybody go to them? Interesting. Listen, Jesus was crucified by the state. Are we to obey that, acknowledge that in the way that they would want us to? And so This has meant that we have to be particularly careful in our discipleship life, in our public life, that if they crucified Jesus in the public square, we will speak God's truth in the public square. It is better to obey God than to obey man. And we will be more effective for our witness when we do so. When we cooperate willingly with what God says. Now, I wasn't going to say this, but I've got a little sticky note here just reminding me. I've written Romans 13 on it. Now, on a couple of occasions, December 22, March 23, a woman on the streets of Britain was arrested for praying silently in her head by the British police. Now, there's a context to this, but praying silently in her head, that's an overreach. Now, we've seen weeks and weeks of thousands upon thousands of people calling for the annihilation of the Jews on British streets. Do you see the tension here? And there's been no arrests, no condemnation. It's a huge problem for us as we try and understand what is going on in the world. When one woman can be arrested for praying silently and tens of thousands of people can effectively call for jihad on the streets of Britain. What's going on? What's going on? Douglas Murray said when a flare goes up, you get to see where everybody is. A flare has gone up in our society in recent weeks, months and years, and you get to see where everybody is. Another example of this would be the tyrannical response of the Canadian government towards the trucker convoy as it related to state overreach in vaccine mandates. My son-in-law is Canadian. He lives in Taunton. And if he had have donated to the fund, would have had his British bank account closed down. Overreach or what? Yes. There are times when we are called to resist. Notice Paul says in the ideal manner, he says, in the ideal manner we are to submit to the authorities. We are not called to obey when the authorities become tyrannies. If only more German Christians stood up to Hitler. Could it have been avoided? Maybe. If only more stood up. But they went along with it. Not only were they silent, they supported the rise of Nazi Germany. And so the German people went from a Romans 13 situation to a Revelation 13 reality. Now we can spot overreach easily enough in our society, our liberal secular society, I suppose, because that's the one that we live in, where all the promises of a happy, glorious, utopian future always end in catastrophe. Every single time. Because it's the spirit of Babel, the Tower of Babel, trying to become God-like, always playing out in culture and society. Now, many of you will have heard of the great Christian writer Os Guinness. He was commentating on cultural movements that often co-opt the state into utopian visions. Here he is particularly critiquing what we know as woke culture. Woke culture, which many of you would have heard of, is an ideologically driven movement that comes straight out of Marxism. Os Guinness said this: "What can we say about the radical left? Their revolutions never succeed, their oppressions never end, and their promised futures never arrive. And it creates a hell on earth." It is when our civic authorities co-opt these values as a replacement to biblical Christianity that we begin to see where the lines are drawn, where people are. It is better to obey God rather than man. There is no justification, church, for using these passages to support uncritical submission to unjust, evil, atheistic, secular, liberal regimes. This is why the second half of chapter 13 sees a shift from the civic life to the moral life. Under this God-ordained governance, our relationships prove God's transforming power. Prove it by the way that we relate with each other. And many times we fail, and we will all know of those situations when, we failed. We prayed the Lord's Prayer earlier. Well, they're all important lines, but the repeated reminder to be forgiven and to forgive is because God has allowed for us to make mistakes, to stumble and fall, only for us to get back up again. And so Paul moves into the relationship side of things, into our neighborhoods, where the only debt we are to have is the debt of love. To love is the only kind of debt that we should have. That's a cool thing, right? So having established the love as the fulfilling of the law, which is what Paul does in verses 11 to 14, he now outlines the Christian life through the idea of time. There are three things here with this. It is time to wake up, he says. It is time to change, he says. It is time to be holy. Which one applies to you mostly, would you say? Don't shout out the answer. Maybe for some, for me, it's probably all three, actually. It is time to wake up. It is time to change. It is time to be holy. And the word slumber that Paul uses suggests being forgetful of what God has said and what God has done. Just not remembering. Remembrance Sunday. Just not remembering what God has said and what God has done and just carrying on your life. But we are Christians at the ready, living between the first and second coming of Christ. I heard someone say, those who are asleep focus on the puppets. Those who are awake focus on who's pulling the strings. It is time to wake up. Number two, Paul says it's time to change. This is about being intentional in your relationship with Christ. Being real. Abiding in Christ. Not being accidental or incidental, but intentional. This is about the life that is radically changed in heart and mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, Paul said in chapter 12. And this is true whether you are a hedonistic, immoral sinner, anybody? Or a sweet old lady, anybody? Either way, we need Christ, whichever way it is. This is the call to wake up, to put on the armor of light that Paul says, and waking up to the reality of spiritual warfare that we are in. We are in a spiritual battle. And it's time to be holy. Oh, I don't like that one. Anyone with me? It's time to be holy. To put on the armor of light is to put on Christ. And when you put on Christ, you can't do the things that gratify, as Paul would say, the desires of the flesh. This is the glory of the gospel. Christian freedom is the discipling of desire. Our desires are good, but they need redeeming. And so we need to learn to love the things that God loves. And so P.T. Forsyth says, the state has unchurched the church more than the church has sanctified the state. We are salt and light in our world, church. But there's more of the state in us than there is of the church in the world. And so I will finish with these words again from chapter 12, verse 2. The solution to this: do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And at the very least, a renewed mind will help you ask the dentist if he's had a quick drink before he does his operation. Church, can I just invite you to close your eyes a moment as we approach communion? Communion is the most transformative power given to the life of the church. A sharing in bread and wine, a sharing in the body and blood. And as you approach, ask Christ the questions that we've raised this morning. In what way do I need to wake up? In what way do I need to change? And in what way do I need to be more holy? You can't do it on your own, by the way. We need Christ. So we come to the table as sinners forgiven by God when we repent of our sins. All glory to Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen.